Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wendy Singer, Director of Education at Illinois Holocaust Museum. I would like to welcome you to today's program and to introduce our Board of Trustee member, Brenda Feiss. Not only is she our member of our Board of Trustees, but she was the first woman board of member trustees to join us and has given so much to the museum and has brought this program to us today. In fact, if you have visited the museum, our light side lobby is named after her family, the Feiss family lobby. Without further ado, Brenda.
Good afternoon. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, our board of directors, our staff, and our volunteers, I'm honored to welcome each of you to today's program. All of you who've joined us here today are well familiar with the mission of our museum, which is expressed in our founding principle: remember the past, transform the future. Our museum is dedicated to preserving the legacy of the Holocaust by preserving the memory of those who were lost, and by teaching universal lessons that combat hatred, prejudice, and indifference, a lesson that's needed now more than ever. Today, our program, Saving Free Speech from Itself with Thane Rosenbaum, provocatively confronts the confusions and contradictions around free speech, examining what is at the heart of this pressing 21st century debate. Thane Rosenbaum is an essayist, a law professor, and author of the novels How Sweet It Is, about my hometown, The Stranger Within Sarah Stein, The Golems of Gotham, Secondhand Smoke, and Elijah Visible. I have read almost all of them. I recommend all of them. His articles, reviews, and essays appear frequently in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, CNN, Haaretz, Huffington Post, and the Daily Beast, among other national publications. He serves as the legal analyst for CBS News Radio and as a columnist for the Jewish News Syndicate. Thane also moderates an annual series of discussions on culture, world events, and politics at the 92nd Street Y in New York City called The Talk Show. He's a distinguished university professor at Touro College, where he directs the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society. Thane is also the author of Payback, The Case for Revenge, and The Myth of Moral Justice, Why Our Legal System Fails to Do What's Right. He's the editor of the anthology Law Lit, From Atticus Finch to the Practice, a collection of great writing about the law. His newly released book is called Saving Free Speech from Itself. So you can probably tell Thane is a pretty big deal, but what makes him a really big deal to me is that Thane is a dear personal friend that I grew up with. And I'm so privileged that he would join us today and honored to have him as my friend. My connection with Thane is actually very pertinent to the museum. Thane and I, to the best of my knowledge, were the only students in our very large public high school in Miami Beach, Florida, who were only children of Holocaust survivors. And I know that it was our unique upbringing that forged a special bond between us, and we have been lifelong friends. So I'm thrilled that he's here today and that our parents are all being honored by this moment. We have hundreds of people attending today's program from around the nation and even the globe, which is pretty exciting. We will have time for a short audience Q&A at the end of the program, so hold on for that. And we will do our best to get as many questions as possible. So without further ado, welcome to my dear friend Thane.
Thank you, Brenda, and hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in tonight around the globe, apparently. Yes, without getting too tearful, I think it's important to point out that Brenda Hoffman in those days and Thane Rosenbaum were little children running around Miami Beach with a secret, which was that their parents were Holocaust survivors. And although Brenda and I were close friends, we shared this legacy, but it was completely unspoken. I don't know if she has a different memory of this, but this is one of those, post-Holocaust, the power of the post-Holocaust of buried trauma mystical forces of the Holocaust. And you're all sort of in participating what I call a lovely, wonderful post-Holocaust anecdote that two children of Holocaust survivors knew this about each other, never mention it, and 47 years later, one of them is a distinguished labor lawyer in Chicago and a trustee of this, just one of the great museums and education centers of Holocaust memory in the world. And her friend, who ended up becoming a writer and a lecturer that dealt a lot of his work with human rights themes, especially related to the Holocaust. And yeah, I think this is a very powerfully profound anecdote. And again, almost part of the wondrous post-Holocaust mysteries that are recounted by many people. I want to also thank you for gathering again here and joining me here, because I was supposed to be at the museum in April for the book tour, and I was scheduled, I think, for April 30th or the 29th, and as we know, COVID canceled it. I've always wanted to visit the museum, and I certainly hope I'll have an opportunity one day. One of my friends, Richard Solomon, is a board member, and he's been raving about it. And of course, I remember Elie Wiesel, who was a friend of mine who had spoken, I think, at the inauguration of your museum. And I want you to know, he came to New York, and I don't know if I was the first call, but I was somewhere on the list, and he said, you have to see this museum. And I always remembered that. And I was always so very, very, very proud that I knew that Brenda and her husband, Lance, were part of the building of it and the maintenance of it and the honoring of it. So I'm with you here in spirit. I hope I'll visit you one day in person. But anyway, thank you for welcoming me again. What I would have said in April, which I will say now, which is that it's not just that Brenda Hoffman was associated with this museum, but I consider Skokie to be an iconic city of the First Amendment. In my mind, it had a lot to do with the writing of this book, Saving Free Speech for Itself. If I was supposed to appear anywhere, it should have been at Skokie, at your museum. Why? Well, when I was 17 years old, Brenda was 17 at the time, a major appellate case in the Seventh Circuit in Chicago was argued, called Collin versus Smith. And I remember as a 17-year-old, although my parents never discussed the Holocaust with me, I was obsessed with this case. I was in high school and I thought, that can't be. Neo-Nazis are going to be marching on a small enclave of Holocaust survivors in Illinois 30 years after the liberation of Auschwitz? That can't possibly be what the First Amendment means. And frankly, it never made sense to me. Years later, I went to law school. I'm sure I was one of those people in constitutional law. When Collin versus Smith was mentioned, I raised my hand and probably said, this is just bananas. This can't possibly be right. There's no way George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison thought that Nazis should be able to march on a hamlet of Holocaust survivors. And throughout all these years as a law professor, I've said very similar things in my classes. And finally, I wrote a book in which Skokie and that case and what happened there in 1977 is recalled. I actually think it's ground zero for when the First Amendment went off the rails, in my mind. And by the way, here's something you should know about Brenda. We don't agree on this subject. You know, she has a much more First Amendment absolutist position than I do. And hopefully I'll end tonight by saying, and that's exactly what our founding fathers thought the First Amendment was about. For Brenda Hoffman, Weiss, and Thane Rosenbaum to respectfully and civilly disagree about some theory of the Constitution, instead of what we have today, shouting people down, canceling them, condemning them, ostracizing them for having an opinion. As you know, you've all lived through this incredibly divisive period in which we live, in which no one is allowed to say their piece. And it's not that they're wrong. We treat them as if there's something morally repugnant about them. That is very different from what the First Amendment was intended to be. And I can assure you the founding fathers would be appalled that this was happening at dinner tables and Shabbat dinner tables around the country. Let me just refresh your recollection for those of you who don't remember what happened. And then I'm going to read you just something from the book. This is all in the book about your town. So the Nazis sought a permit in 1977, precisely because at the time, I don't know if it's true, Skokie had the largest per capita percentage of Holocaust survivors anywhere in the United States. And Brenda probably didn't realize, even more so than Miami Beach. And the reason she knows that is she and I were the only two people who were only children of Holocaust survivors. The neo-Nazis knew where to go. They went to Skokie. Of course, the ACLU represented them for free. Of course, Jewish lawyers represented the neo-Nazis for free. And of course, because of that representation, the city, even in attempting to pass ordinances that would prevent such a march for the very reasons such a march should have been prevented, was deemed unconstitutional. The Supreme Court didn't even take up your case. You know why? They thought it was not worth it. It's too obvious. Of course, the neo-Nazis have rights to traumatize Holocaust survivors. Of course, that's what the First Amendment means. The Seventh Circuit actually said astonishing things. It acknowledged at the time, among many theories, was that it would cause emotional distress to the Holocaust survivors. By the way, in those days, the word Holocaust survivor wasn't even in use. It was European refugees, victims of the Holocaust. We didn't really refer to them in those days, I don't believe, as Holocaust survivors. The court said, look, we're fully aware of how traumatic this would be, but the burden, are you ready for this? This is, I remember this from in high school. The burden is on the survivors to not show up to the Village Green. That's their burden. If they don't like it, even though we recognize it will cause damage, we suggest that they just stay home. And I'm thinking, you mean the taxpayers of Skokie can't go walk Green because they'll be assaulted by neo-Nazis who don't pay taxes in Skokie? How does that make sense? But yes, the Seventh Circuit actually thought that made sense. Let me read something to you from the book. The expected outcome did not disappoint. The buildup to a march that in the end would never even take place because it had already achieved its purpose, reinvigorating in the minds of Skokie's Holocaust survivors the psychological trauma of past persecution. One survivor, her name is Erna Gans, I don't know if she's still alive, I don't know if anyone out there remembers her, said in 1978, quote, "Yes, it did terrorize us. It brought back many hours of anguish, something we thought we left behind. This realization brought back a terror. Here we are again in the same position. For some, it was very realistic. It is here today, and I'm going to get killed." The corporation counsel for Skokie, Harvey Schwartz, I hope he's still alive. He was your chief lawyer in Skokie in '77, meaning he was arguing on behalf of Skokie to prevent the Nazis from making that appearance on that day. He was interviewed a year after the case, and he recalled the state of mind of the survivors on the day when the neo-Nazis came closest to actually entering the village. This is your corporate counsel. In 1977, in 78, he said, he was referring to Holocaust survivors from Skokie, and this is what he said: "They were a changed people, fanatical, irrational, frightened, angry. No one could possibly appeal to them with any reasonable argument. They were possessed, some of them. It was as if they had repressed something for 20 years that was now loose. It was very disturbing." And I put this in italics. At this point, I realized, meaning Harvey Schwartz, that the First Amendment theory grossly underestimated the impact on these people. Wow, what a great line. Grossly underestimated, and the First Amendment theory grossly underestimated the impact on these people. And then he then says, this was not an exchange of ideas. It was literally an assault, which is something I talk about in the book, about the weaponization of speech, speech that truly can cause harm. People there on that Saturday were injured, damaged, I dare say even physically. So that's Harvey Schwartz. I don't know if anyone has any memory of him, but that is an extraordinary quote. By the way, he was onto something. He was way ahead of his time, because in the book I talk about how the First Amendment seems to be based on a nursery rhyme. Isn't that ridiculous? The First Amendment is based on a nursery rhyme? Yeah, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names cannot hurt me. That's the general thesis of our First Amendment, that whatever pain comes from speech needs to be tolerated because it's not like sticks and stones that will break bones. But of course, you all know as parents that even though you told your children that nursery rhyme, it's utter nonsense. Everyone knows it's utter nonsense. Words hurt. They can hurt. And by the way, in the book, I talk about recent studies in neuroscience. It's overwhelming. And remember, when Harvey Schwartz said this, dare I say physically, he was onto something decades before his time. They have now determined that pervasive, persistent stress, humiliation, indignity, persecution, intimidation, incitement from words and signage not only causes emotional harm, but gets you physically sick. Harvey Schwartz was onto, he knew. Heart disease, hypertension, all sorts of inflammation that's related to this level of stress from severe harm that's caused by traumatic speech. Speech intended to threaten, incite, intimidate, treat with indignity. I'm so happy to be able to share that with you because I've always thought that since that time, the cases got worse in my view, and I'll talk about a few of them. As Brenda pointed out, the book was written because I believe there's been an enormous confusion and conflict around free speech as of late. And the presumptions and premises about free speech legally and morally are in conflict. And let me give you some examples. After the Skokie case, there were a number of cases that what I call the cross-burning cases. And guess what? The Supreme Court is clear. You can burn a cross on an African-American's lawn. Of course you can. Of course the KKK should have a right to do that. And of course the ACLU should represent them for free. I know if you're thinking the way I was thinking in 77, all these years, it's bananas. Yes, but of course they have the right to do this. But yet here's a conflict on university campuses today, state schools in particular, which means that they are also by definition required to abide by the First Amendment, no different like the town of Skokie. They too have to observe the First Amendment. There is the banning of books like Huckleberry Finn because there's use of the N-word. One of my favorite anecdotes just happened recently. 3 professors, are you all sitting down for this? 3 professors, one from Stanford, one from UCLA, and one from the New School in New York, each in class read the N-word, said the N-word in class, one of whom read from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham prison in which the N-word is used. Another read from a James Baldwin essay, one of the great African-American essayists in the United States. And another read from some rap lyrics. All 3 professors were disciplined. What? I understand. The KKK has the right to burn a cross on African-Americans' lawns, but professors can't mention the N-word in class, even if they're quoting the words of African-Americans. The New York Times recently had a shakeup, as you may remember, not long ago, all on account of Black Lives Matter. The New York Times published an op-ed from Senator Cotton from Arkansas in response to the looting and vandalism that were offshoots of the Black Lives Matter protests, suggested that the Insurrection Act, a statute that was used to protect African Americans in the Deep South and allow them to integrate universities, should be re-invoked for the purpose of quelling violence in cities that were responding to the Black Lives Matter movement. The op-ed, by the way, at the time, 62% of the Americans believed that that would be an appropriate gesture. The New York Times ended up having people resign, forcibly removed to other departments, and an apology was issued for even publishing the op-ed. The New York Times couldn't publish an op-ed by a United States senator who actually was reflecting the opinion of 62% of the United States that maybe the army should be brought in to quell the violence that's somewhat related to the Black Lives Matter movement. The New York Times position was the employees threatened to walk out because they said this endangered the lives of African-American editors who worked there. How? How did that op-ed do that, right? So and it really is, it's just when you think about this is the New York Times. So on the one hand, the KKK, the government can't regulate them. On the other hand, newspapers, universities are self-censoring, are ostracizing, morally banishing people who say things that you're purportedly in the woke intersectional protocols of university life, you're not allowed to say. The Skokie March and the Charlottesville March from a few years ago. Remember Charlottesville? The alt-right was represented by lawyers from the ACLU, of course. And they got to march and they said, Jews will not replace us, with tiki torches and wearing military fatigues. All ostensibly for the reason because there was going to be the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee. But I don't understand what's the phrase, Jews will not replace us, have anything to do with Jews. I don't think Robert E. Lee knew any Jews. I don't understand that connection, but the court certainly determined that the alt-right had the right to do that. So that's okay, and the Skokie March is okay. And yeah, I got news for you. If the neo-Nazis wanted to march again on Skokie, they would have to be welcome in your town, even 40 some odd years later, 43 or 47 years later, 43 years later. But at the same time, on university campuses, students who support Israel are harassed. They're subject to ridicule. They're given tests about whether they're Zionists and therefore treated accordingly if they say that they are. Speak pro-Israel speakers are shouted down on university campuses. You know how I know that? I'm one of them. It's happened to me at a number of schools, including at Berkeley, which is the home of the free speech movement. How can that happen at a place like University of California and Berkeley? So I don't get it. The neo-Nazis can march, the alt-right can march, but you can't support Israel on campuses. We know there's an enormous amount. I'm saying, where's the free speech here? Isn't this fundamentally in conflict, inconsistent? Either we believe in free speech in every way capacity, in the way that we claim that it's our most foundational principle right that we were given. It's, by the way, the best known right in the Bill of Rights by far. It tends to be the one right in the Bill of Rights that both liberals and conservatives agree on. And in a moment, I'll tell you that even other countries look at us and think we're nuts. It's not just me. But there's a conflict and we're not recognizing, we're not having a conversation about, I don't understand, why is that considered free speech, protected expressive activity under the Constitution? And why is the other thing something not permitted at all? One of my other favorite cases, an ignominious case, Snyder versus Phelps. We know we're living in an era of heightened sensitivity to LBGT right sensitivities and protocols. I think that's great. I think that's important. But the Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas is opposed to homosexuals serving in the military. They're so opposed to that they go to the funerals of dead Marines and they hold up signs. They get permits like the neo-Nazis did in Skokie, and they hold up signs that says, this is within sight of the funeral parents are burying their children, and the signs say, God hates fags. Thank God for 9/11. God hates you. Do I need to repeat that? That's what these people do. They fly around the country and did this. The father of that dead Marine brought a lawsuit, a civil lawsuit against the church for emotional distress. My son died fighting for this country in Afghanistan. And my last attempt to say goodbye to my son was interrupted by your speech rights. I was emotionally damaged from that. A local jury from that state granted the family millions of dollars. And guess what? The Supreme Court, 8-1, overturned the verdict and forced Mr. Phelps or Snyder, I can't remember which is which, the father, to pay the legal fees of the church. 8-1. Only Justice Alito took a Thane Rosenbaum, this is bananas. Really? Now, let me ask you something. In the book, I talk about this all the time. You know how people oftentimes say, well, what would Jesus do? In my book, I say, well, what would George Washington do? What would he say? If you think George Washington, the leader of the Continental Army, the colonial army, a ragtag army that improbably defeated the British in the Revolutionary War, believed that the First Amendment would be used to torment a family whose son died in battle fighting for the United States, you're out of your mind. You're absolutely out of your mind. There is no way that the founding fathers believed this is what the First Amendment did. This is the abuse of a free speech right. These are not ideas that are being offered. This is violence disguising itself as speech, weaponization, signage, and speech designed to do one thing only, cause harm. Let me tell you something, Westboro Baptist Church. If you're so opposed to gays serving in the military, go write an op-ed. I'm sure there'll be lots of misspellings. I'm just a guess, but write an op-ed. That's how it's done. That's how America rolls. We don't destroy the last resting place of a boy that died fighting for this country. But I'm wrong. The Supreme Court says I'm wrong, 8-1. And in fact, Chief Justice Roberts, I found the case appalling. He gave us a tutorial. Don't you all understand what the First Amendment is? Don't you understand what it does? The Danish cartoons, remember the Danish cartoons and then the French cartoons that mocked the Prophet Muhammad? Why? Remember, Islam is not just a religion. Islam is also a political movement, right? It's political Islam. Muhammad is the one prophet in any of the religions who is both a prophet and a general. People don't know this. This is a reason why the Quran actually can serve as the basis of some, some theocratic society. The cartoons were there to raise questions between the relationship between Islam and terrorism. And as you know, there was violence all over the world and killings and murders at the kosher market in Paris as well, on account of these cartoons. Why? Well, we're told that because they're offensive. Has anyone seen the Book of Mormon? I love this anecdote. The Book of Mormon just shatters, destroys Mormonism. I mean, it just is relentless on it. On the opening day in Broadway of the Book of Mormon, was there a bomb that went off? No, of course not. Was anyone complaining that you're not allowed to? Of course not. This is, you should have free speech. And by the way, in the Mormon case, they were actually just attacking the religion without its politics, right? In theory, the Danish cartoons were about the politics of Islam, not just the religion of Islam. There was an ad taken out in the playbill in Broadway on opening night of the Book of Mormon, which read, "You've now seen the play. Now come to one of our churches and see the real thing." Yeah, that's right. The ideas are always subject to discussion. Yeah, you don't have to get blown up about it. But it's confusing, right? Because on the one hand, we're supposed to respect the free exchange of ideas. And at the other hand, we're not sure, right? Yale University published a book about the cartoons. And you know what? It's not in the book, the cartoons. They wouldn't put it in there. Why? They were afraid the university would get bombed or the library would get bombed. All right. So what does free speech mean in our contemporary of our contemporary society at all? So these are, you know, questions even related to the permissiveness when it comes to government regulation, and the anything goes when it comes outside of the government. YouTube, social media, right? You know, the thing that's important to understand is that the European democracies, also liberal democracies, also founded by the cradle of the Enlightenment, they all read the same books, the enlightened philosophers of the 19th century, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Hume, Jefferson. All those constitutions in all of those liberal Western democracies were all based on similar principles. But they don't put up with any of this. Why? In Germany and Austria, if you wanted to do what the neo-Nazis did in Skokie, you would be marched straight to jail. In France, there's still a shock comic comedian. His name is Mbala Dieudonné. And this is his act. He gets up on stage and he says, "Don't you think we should bring back the gas chambers? I mean, really, don't you think we should just gas some Jews and then cremate them?" And then he gives a list of Jews in France who should be gassed and cremated. And guess what then happens? He goes to jail. Yeah. Why? Well, because that's not speech. There's no attempt there for robust debate, for the exchange of ideas. It's there only to harm. What makes us different? Why are we an outlier when it comes to free speech? Why do they think we're ridiculous? The Germans, who know something about neo-Nazis, looked at the Skokie case and thought the people of Illinois are out of their minds. They did. It's nothing personal. I'm just saying the Germans in 1977 read what you were doing and they thought you were out of your minds because they know what they do with Nazis, right? Why is that different? Well, because those constitutions all have one word that our Constitution doesn't mention at all. And you know what that word is? Dignity, human dignity. It doesn't appear in the Constitution. It doesn't appear in the Bill of Rights. It doesn't appear in any of the amendments to the Constitution. It doesn't appear in the Declaration of Independence. One word, never. It's repeatedly invoked in Germany, France, the United Kingdom. Hey, guess what? Israel doesn't have a constitution. It has what's called basic laws. So you could say they're like the Bill of Rights. There was some thought that eventually all the basic laws would be collapsed into a constitution. Remember, Israel's still a very young country, and that may still happen. But in the meantime, they just have these things called basic laws. You want to hear something great anecdote for you all today? Israel has free speech, of course, it's a liberal democracy, but they don't actually have a free speech clause in any of the basic laws. They just know they have free speech. But you know what they have? Basic law number 5, human dignity. They have a provision related to human dignity, the respect that a human being has simply because he or she is a citizen of the country. That's what citizenship means. That's what it confers. The freedom to be able to, what I love, and one of my favorite quotes in the book is from Lyndon Johnson, who said during the civil rights era, he said, "A man has a right to go outside of his house with his children and not be humiliated in front of them." Very wise words. It's true. No parent should have to explain to a child signage on a wall that says, "Kill Jews," "Towel heads go home," N-word, "string them up," see a noose on a tree and have to explain to a boy what it means. No, parents should not. That is not equality. That doesn't give people a firm sense that they can participate in representative democracy. If something as simple as their ability to go outside without being attacked, you could say, well, they have a right to answer. What? We put the burden on marginalized people to justify their existence? You think that Jews should have to debate, no, I have a right to live? You think that's right? We should force African Americans into such an undignified position? Yes, it's now my turn to speak. I have the right to live. That's not what the founding fathers were talking about. When they understood the public square, they understood a place where human betterment takes place because of the exchange of ideas that advance science, politics, and culture. Advance us, not threaten us, not intimidate us, not dehumanize us, not treat us with inhumanity and indignity, but better us, not marching on Holocaust survivors. Do you know what I've forgotten it. I was getting ready for my Skokie moment today because I was so excited about this. I went to look at what the Nazis were going to hand out, their leaves, the leaflets. One of them said, ready for this? This was for your town. This was what they were handing out in 1977. Wherever there are Jews, there are Jew haters. And the second one was, we are coming to get you. There are ideas there? I'm sorry, I don't get it. You know, my really good friend Nadine Strawson, the former president of ACLU, just like Brenda Hoffman and I, you know, Nadine and I have debated this subject all over the country many times. We're very civil and cordial to each other. She thinks I'm out of my mind. I think she's bananas, but we're able to have this conversation. Why? Because we're having a civilized debate. I'm not saying kill Nadine Strawson. That's not what I think I have the freedom to do, or to treat her with disrespect and incite violence against her. No, that's not what the founding fathers thought the First Amendment was there. It was truly there to invigorate conversation, to make us all better, not worse. So we see this in many different ways. Again, conflicts. YouTube is unregulated in the United States, in Facebook. In Europe, it's overregulated. There are deletion centers. I think there's 1,500 people in Europe, or maybe it's just in Europe, that Facebook hires to go through to make sure that terrorist propaganda and hate crimes are eliminated from the pages. Not in the United States. How do you know this? Well, the Boston Marathon bombers, the Tsarnaev brothers, learned how to make a bomb in their mother's kitchen watching YouTube. A few years ago, there was a terrorist in New York who rented a van from Hertz and mowed down people in Manhattan off Chambers Street. You know how they did that? There was a page in a magazine that you could look online for Al-Qaeda that showed you that said, you don't realize what a great weapon a Hertz truck is. This is what it said. Here's how you rent the truck. Here's how you use the truck. Here's how you mow people down. That's on YouTube. You can learn that. Major Hassan, the killer at Fort Hood, was radicalized by Awan Awlaki. His sermons, his radicalizing Islamic sermons on YouTube. Mark Zuckerberg, that genius from Facebook who didn't graduate college, and it shows you it's a problem when you don't graduate college, you say really stupid things. When he was asked why he doesn't take down Holocaust denial pages, he said on Facebook, he said, I'm sorry, it just makes me laugh, what an idiot. He said, well, we don't punish people on Facebook because people simply have the wrong information. He thinks the Nazis don't know that they're wrong. He thinks that if they just read more books, they wouldn't be neo-Nazis. They would love Jews. They just have the wrong information. He doesn't understand what their agenda is. He's saying, look, we have to educate them. So we have to provide all kinds of sources for information. Well, but not in Europe. He couldn't pull that off in Europe. By the way, as you know, it's been coming up lately because we see YouTube doesn't even, and Twitter, they don't even provide, they claim to not be a news source, but they censor information that they don't want to hear. right? So for instance, you know, the Hunter Biden story, we've seen examples of this. They're the censoring of these entities. 20, I think, what was the number? 20,000 Israelis filed a civil suit against Facebook for a page that's called, are you ready? Stab Israelis. You can go find it. Stab Israelis is the page. 20,000 Israelis filed civil suit against Facebook to take this down, damages, because it was clearly incitement of terrorism. Apparently on the page, I've never looked at it because I wouldn't dignify it, but apparently there's a page of a knife with blood on it about to go into the head of a Hasidic Jew. Facebook, right? This is a clear hate crime, but hate crimes are protected. There are no hate crimes in the United States. In Europe, those are hate crimes. There's no way you could be able to provide anything like that. Guess what? The Israelis lost that suit, of course, because the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act makes internet providers immune from the content they put on their pages. And you may see there's been more debates about that nowadays. So social media can be used as a platform for terrorists, as a place where misinformation is supplied. But my friend Steven Pinker, who teaches, he's a very famous evolutionary psychologist from Harvard, he published, he was almost removed from an academic society in which he's an esteemed member, because they saw in one of his writings that he believed that racism was actually decreasing over time, which is something you're not allowed to say today, that racism is actually decreasing. He was threatened to be removed from this academic society. Where's the free speech in that? A Google engineers, they're all PhDs, was fired because he wrote an inter-office memo in which he wanted to have a conversation about why there aren't more women engineers in advancing in the software business. The fact that he wanted to have that conversation and that it might be related to a lack of technical skill or whatever it is that the implication was being, he was fired. He thought that he was writing a memo that everyone would get to discuss. No. A data analyst was recently fired because he said that in connection with Black Lives Matter, that the more Black Lives Matter protests, if there's looting and violence or vandalism, it tends to increase the votes of Republicans and energizes them politically. He was fired. He was fired for stating the obvious, that Republicans might be unduly influenced by seeing violence in the street because Republicans tend to be law and order, the party of law and order. That's sort of obvious. I don't even think you need to be a statistician to know that. Why was he fired? Hey, I'm no fan of Roseanne Barr. Her tweet about Valerie Jarrett was disgusting. Yeah, but how come no one said, if you really believe in free speech, you know, she's a raunchy comedian, right? She's no genius. You know, it was a horrible thing to say. If people don't want to watch her TV show, that's fine. But she was fired. Her career is over, right? And again, I understand, and I make this clear in the book, the First Amendment doesn't work between individuals. It doesn't work even in the private sector. The First Amendment, as all the Bill of Rights are written, as the government shall not do something, meaning it's not there giving you an affirmative right. The Constitution essentially provides you a negative right. It's not that you can affirmatively have a right to free speech. It's that the government can't prohibit your speech. So as I would teach my students, that's the difference between a positive right and a negative right. So the Constitution is written about what the government cannot do to you, as opposed to the rights that you affirmatively have. So when two friends are on a street in their street corner and they're arguing, and one of them says something the other doesn't like, and the other one says, "Stop talking, I don't want to hear from you anymore." The other one says, "What are you talking about? This is a free country. I have a free speech right to say whatever I want." That's not actually right. He can say whatever he wants. He could be a terrible friend, but that's not what the First Amendment is about, because the First Amendment is really there to deal with the curtailment of free expression from the government. But if conservatives and liberals all agree that the First Amendment and free speech is our most sacred, our most valued, treasured freedom, then why don't we accept it everywhere? Why is it that neo-Nazis can march and the town of Skokie can't stop them? But I can tell you right now that, you know, anytime you associate rioting, looting, and vandalism with Black Lives Matter, you'll be charged as a racist. I know this because I'm charged as a racist every 10 minutes. You invoke the words, I mean, you're a suburb of Chicago. This is more real to you than it is to me, but I know that if you say the words black on black crime in Chicago, you are a racist and you will be shunned, you will be canceled, your career will be over by simply making the point that, in fact, the real killer of African Americans, as horrible as police violence is, and by the way, I'm no fan of the police. I just don't believe the police are targeting African Americans. I just don't believe it. And I actually agree with, you know, criminologists and people who study this that said the numbers of killings of black on black crime is, especially in Chicago, is something that is a real national problem that we need to address. But today, to mention it, it's considered a racist comment. By the way, black on black crime is racist, but I believe in Oberlin, a university professor objected to the Holocaust, and you should know this, or not so, you should care about this because you're all connected to this wonderful museum. A professor from Oberlin, I'm pretty sure it's Oberlin, wrote, "We should not be offering any courses on the Holocaust in this university at all, or college at all. And you know why? Because it's white on white crime, and white on white crime doesn't count." Wow, I don't know. I don't know what to say. I want to say that, you know, we're, again, shutting down conversations that we should feel free to have, shutting down academic disciplines that we should be open for debate, and in the true spirit of what it was that our founding fathers intended. And let me go back to the point that I said before about Mr. Schwartz. You know, it's all really based, you know, before I get to what Mr. Schwartz said about, Harvey Schwartz said about, you know, physically damaged, it's all based, you know, the First Amendment is based, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote this in Abrams versus the United States around World War I, on a principle that the free speech tolerates more speech than less speech because of the marketplace of ideas. Oliver Wendell Holmes introduced this idea. More speech is better because more speech will get canceled out by good speech. The bad speech will cancel out, the good speech will cancel out bad speech. So that's why this overly permissive, overly liberalized First Amendment understanding of the free exercise of expression. That's a core principle of why it is that this is accepted. So the question then becomes, well, does that work? Is there really a marketplace of ideas? It's based on a principle of the rational actor, laissez-faire, Adam Smith capitalism, right? More is better, offering more, because the good will win out over the bad. Here's something I wrote about in the book about the marketplace of ideas that's related to Skokie. Back in the late 1970s, the Jews of Skokie, Illinois, a mere 30 years after the end of World War II and the liberation of Auschwitz, must have wondered why the pernicious ideas, in quotes, of the Nazis had returned, this time with the neo prefix, yet there was nothing new about their abhorrent anti-Semitism. Had their ideas not already been rejected in the marketplace? How can Nazi propaganda actually still be for sale? After losing the war and having been judged guilty of committing crimes against humanity, the Nazis had already lost the argument. Their ideology had been thoroughly rejected. Their ideas deemed without redemption. What kind of a sleazy marketplace is this? Yes, I asked you this question. Everybody knows that if you believe in a free market, in the free marketplace, laissez-faire capitalism, you believe that the person who makes the best toothbrush will survive. The best computer company will win out and businesses will fall. But this unregulated speech market doesn't work in the same way. And the best example, and no one knows this more than the people from Skokie, are Nazis. Because after the Nuremberg trials, if the marketplace ideas works in the way they claim it works, that we would never hear from Nazis again. No one would ever talk about Mein Kampf. No one would ever dress up in brown shirts and jackboots. No one else would Heil Hitler. They would just say, well, the marketplace of ideas rejected Nazism, so we have to think about new political movements, not that one. In every other place, even though the United States sees itself as a free market economy, and it is, we know in Chicago, what is it, the Commercial Board of Trade Futures, right? The CFTC, I think that's what it's called. Sorry, I probably should know that. You have a market there that regulates cotton and orange juice and coffee, the sale of it. The SEC is responsible as a law enforcement over the sale of shares of stock. The FDA just proved that it can decide when we get the vaccine for the coronavirus, no matter what the president was trying to say, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. The government regulates drugs. Thank God. Thank God people just can't make their own drugs and hand them out. Food is the same thing, right? Contaminated food. Why is it that we can regulate, we permit some government regulation that is sensible, right? When it comes to these other areas of marketplace freedoms and not when it comes to speech. By the way, the one amendment that's similar to this, ironically, is the Second Amendment. Because in my view, and I say this in the book, First Amendment absolutists are just as crazy as Second Amendment absolutists. Both groups are bananas, even though they don't really have much in common other than they're crazy. Why? Well, because if you ask a First Amendment absolutist why the government can't in any way regulate anything, nothing, can't stop you from speaking, and I'll talk about that in a second because there are some prescribable categories, the answer is always the same. If they stop me from saying one thing, the next thing they'll do is stop me from criticizing the government, right? It's what I call the argument of the hysteric, right? If the Nazis aren't allowed to march in Skokie and hang out at the Village Green, the next thing we won't be able to criticize President Reagan. Really? Well, the Second Amendment crazies say the same thing. If you take away my deer rifle, if you take away my submachine gun, my AKR, whatever they're called, assault rifles, the next thing you know, you'll take away my deer hunting rifle. Really? That's the next thing that's going to happen? You're sure about that? That's what you think is going to happen next? It's what's euphemistically known as, in law schools, the slippery slope, which I always say is, an excuse not to take a moral position, to use, a slippery slope argument. What's the argument? The argument, well, who gets to decide? Well, I'll tell you who gets to decide. Jurors are asked all the time to stand in judgment and determine facts of things they don't know anything about because they don't have the technical capacity, right? Copyright infringement, various cases, very complicated cases, and 12 peers, jurors sit in judgment and establish what the facts are. Everyone's been humiliated. Everyone knows what it's like to be sort of devastated with indignity. Everyone knows something about that. To say that jurors aren't going to be able to distinguish between the mere slight offense as opposed to the thing that really rocks your world, shakes you, causes both physical and emotional harm, I think people understand. I don't think there's a big line drawing problem. And the other argument by the way, about the slippery slope is the following. The slippery slope assumes that the thing you're talking about is bad. It's an acknowledgement, it's bad, but we are afraid it could get worse, right? So if you're making a slippery slope argument, you're essentially saying, I understand, words are really harmful. I get it. And as I said before, the science is not even in dispute, right? The science is clear. And throughout the book, several chapters in which I talk about when you connect the human brain to PET scans and MRI scans, you learn that certain sectors of the brain light up when exposed to this level of pervasive intolerance, incitement, humiliation, indignity. It does, in fact, cause harm, cause damage. Is speech unlimited? Well, no, even today, within the absolutist world, you know that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. By the way, you can yell fire in an empty theater, but that's insane. But you're not permitted, and there's a reason for that, because it would cause a stampede and people would get hurt. And even in schools, you just can't get up and make speeches. By the way, although the NFL changed its position, they tended to be correct when they prevented Collin Kaepernick from taking a knee, right? Why? Well, because if the state of Illinois passed a statute that said all athletes must stand at attention during the playing of the national anthem, that would violate the First Amendment, the government curtailing your speech. But your employer can tell you what you should wear to work and what you should stand at attention when something happens. It's an employment principle. It's a condition, a term of an employment. Brenda Hoffman and big time labor lawyers will say, well, that depends on the collective bargaining. I get it. I understand those are contractual issues, but the employer can set the terms for that contract. And some superstar lawyer like Brenda Hoffman Feiss can go in and beat the employer down. I'm not sure who she represents nowadays, employers and employees, but that's a very different idea, that the employer has a right to ask you to stand at attention and not take a knee. Now, we know the NFL reversed itself, but that's a very good example of what I was saying before. The First Amendment is about the curtailment of speech, restrictions of speech on people by governments, not by private entities. But it goes back to the point I said before. But do we really believe in free speech or not? Because if we really believe in free speech, why can't Collin Kaepernick just put his knee down? What's the big deal, right? Why didn't we just say to the San Francisco 49ers? Well, mostly because the fans didn't like it and they complained, and the NFL got nervous and they told the teams not to let that happen. Black Lives Matter changed, and now apparently, the rules have changed, right? But I'm talking about a general understanding. Do we believe in unfettered free speech or we don't? Because as I pointed out in the last hour or so, there's vast contradictions, vast conflicts. On the one hand, neo-Nazis, Klansmen can do what they want to scare the hell out of people. On the other hand, a pro-Israel speaker will get shouted down. Somebody that wants to raise a question about some data point or science point about racism or female intelligence or whatever it is, those things, you get kicked off of campus, you lose your academic credentials, you get humiliated, they withdraw your op-ed. The New York Times, the paper of record, I want to repeat that, apologized for publishing an op-ed written by a United States senator who took a position based on a federal statute that was once used to protect African Americans, and that 62% of Americans actually agreed with. And that the New York Times felt so threatened by their own employees that they had to fire people, release people, transfer people, and apologize for the op-ed. Where's the free speech in that? It's just an idea, right? What is it? And at the same time, when it comes to our permissiveness about speech, Nazis, alt-right, KKK, what makes us so different from the Europeans? Why would we tolerate it and they wouldn't? Well, it's about human dignity. There are some state statutes that do that here as well. But any of you seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street? You may remember there's this vulgar scene where they throw dwarfs into targets, treat them like darts. It's a game. Do you know in France, there's a national law, you're not allowed to do that to a dwarf, even if the dwarf wants the job. Even if you could pay the dwarf anything, it's against the law to do it. You know why? it's an indignity to the dwarfs, to the community, right? That is something the French will simply not abide. It's a hate crime. Endless examples, particularly in France, about their understanding of dignity and the lengths to which people would go. In the United States, you know about the perp walk, where you get arrested and the press has a photo of you and you have your head down or you try to get a coat over your head. Perp walks are unlawful in France. Why? Well, if you're innocent until proven guilty, there's an indignity and humiliation for people to see you in such a compromising position. You haven't done anything wrong yet. You've just been arrested. That's how wide dignity stretches in other liberal democracies, and that would not be acceptable here. Let me just briefly talk about our founding fathers, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. The First Amendment originally didn't even have speech in it. Remember, the Constitution was written and then they added the amendments, the Bill of Rights. Why was that? Well, frankly, because they didn't feel, mostly the southern states, they were afraid of centralized government powers. And this country was traumatized by King George III. So all the Bill of Rights are written, if you read them, they're all really written about the kinds of stuff that King George III used to do to us before the Revolutionary War. So if you look at them, they're all like sort of related to things that he did. That's why they're written, the government shall not, right? So the Bill of Rights were added later just as a precaution to make sure the government didn't overreach and exert rights it wasn't entitled to over the liberty, which is what our country believed in, the liberty of 19th century enlightenment and natural rights. The free speech wasn't in it first, freedom of expression. They were mostly interested in freedom of press, and they were interested in freedom of religion and even assembly. Speech was an afterthought. By the way, it was only added reluctantly because Pennsylvania, New York, and one other state had put speech in their constitutions, state constitutions. So finally, Hamilton and Madison said, all right, what the hell, let's put it in this too. But they were very clear in their letters to each other that while there is a right to express yourself, as long as it doesn't conflict with the other rights reserved for other citizens. That makes total sense. Why did we lose that concept? Time and time again, the founding fathers said, as long as it doesn't conflict with other rights. Why did we understand, and it started in the 1960s, by the way, the free speech, what I'm describing, what I call the overreach and excesses of the free speech movement started in the 1960s. For the first 180 years or however long that was, or our nation, there were government restrictions. There was examples of curtailments of prior restraints where the government actually restricted speech. The 60s, with the complete, as you know, overhaul of criminal justice, the Miranda warnings, think about the various social activism of the 1960s that got increased throughout that decade. One of them also was speech, and all the major free speech cases, United States versus Cohen, or Cohen versus United States rather, Feinberg, these are all cases that showed up as part of the upheavals of social justice from the 1960s. Guess what? Skokie, 1977. This is new. The founding fathers would not recognize what we've done, which is why I said they would be very surprised to hear that the neo-Nazis, if you told them there was something called the Holocaust, and it just so happened, for whatever reason, I never knew the answer to this, Skokie attracted a very large percentage of survivors. And guess what? The Nazis decide that they're still around, they're new, and they get to come and traumatize, re-traumatize these people. And that the courts would say they would side with the Nazis and tell the taxpayers who are Jews of Skokie to stay home. Don't come outside. It'll be too upsetting for you. The founding fathers would be very surprised. Why? Speech was very clear. It was about soapboxes and public squares. Public squares are important because the more you debate ideas, the better government will become as decision makers. It was a way for the people to engage in representative participatory democracy, to in a way protest with the government and tell the government what they think the people would like, right? To feel that they would not be thrown in jail like King George would have done if they say, we think the taxes are too high, right? Which is what happened with the stamps and tea, right? The Boston Tea Party, I think that's what that was about. All these taxes that the people have the right to protest and say, we think taxes are too high, and we don't go to jail for simply saying that. That's what they were interested in. People speaking to their government, trying to help the government make better decisions. People speaking to each other to try to engage in advancement of ideas, culture, politics, science. It was about the betterment of people and better decision-making of government. It was not to give the rights to one group who hates another group to harm them, to incite violence against them, right? To cause them emotional and physical harm. We already have some prescribable categories. And in the book, I talk about things we could do, not even drastic things, to introduce these dignity elements into the Constitution. It doesn't even necessarily require like a new constitutional amendment, although I wouldn't mind seeing a dignity amendment, just like the Europeans have, or by the way, the Israelis have. It would not hurt us to have a human dignity amendment. But there are already prescribable categories. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And you can't, libel, slander, defamation is not, there's no freedom of speech. Obscenity, there's no freedom of speech. The incitement of imminent lawlessness. What if the Nazis had come to the village green of Skokie and made speeches to other non-Jews and others who would come into town and said, let's go beat up the Jews of Skokie? That there's no free speech to. That's under Brandenburg versus Ohio. That's called the incitement of imminent lawlessness. You don't have a free speech right to that. But there is another United States Supreme Court case, Shaplinsky versus the United States, which no one uses anymore. No one speaks about it anymore. But that actually does pick up on many of the themes in this book that said that there's some speech that has no value, that is not about the exposition of ideas, that isn't really there to achieve a truth. It's really there to just cause violence, to cause someone else to punch your face in, right? It has no other purpose. For there are reasons, but there's some reasons in this pro-free speech era in which we're living, Shaplinsky versus the United States is basically disfavored law and never comes up. So again, this is what the founding fathers wanted for us. Somewhere along the line, we lost the memo. We changed the whole contour of what free speech looks like to the point where, you know, someone like me says it's bananas, right? By the way, you should know, be careful if you repeat anything that I say, because my view is considered scandalous. It's seditious. It's simply un-American. What I just said for the last hour is something that people don't, and especially don't go to University of Chicago Law School. They'll tell you I'm insane, right? You're not allowed to say any of the things that I've just said because we as a country have a very clear understanding of a robust free speech that has almost as minimal government regulation as possible. That's the goal. But let me conclude by reminding you that my childhood friend, Brenda Hoffman, who is a trustee of your museum, and she and her husband, now I understand it's a lobby there, and they believe in so many of the things that I believe in with respect to Holocaust memory. Brenda doesn't agree with me pretty much on most of what I've just said. It is the contrarian position. It is considered a radical position, but the purpose of the saving free speech from itself was to say that it's precisely because this is a radical position that it has led to so many contradictions and confusions, especially now in the 21st century. And this book, Saving Free Speech from Itself, is attempting to explain those contradictions and set us on a path for a more sensible understanding of what the free speech clause of the First Amendment means. Thank you all. I think there's some questions coming up, Megan. I think I ended on time.
Yes, thank you so much, Thane, for that really interesting and very informative presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Megan Gieseker, and I am the Education Associate at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. I will be moderating the Q&A today with Thane. We had many comments and tons of questions come in. We will share the comments with Thane, but we will be focusing just on the questions for right now. And I will do my best to try to get to as many as I possibly can with the time that we have left. So to start off, how do you draw the line between acceptable and non-acceptable speech? Is there some objective standard rather than the subjective view of the decision maker?
Good question. Before that, I do that, Megan, I just realized I didn't tie up my ending with why I mentioned Brenda. Because the disagreement that she and I would have and the way we disagree is exactly what the founding fathers wanted. That's what they want. Two people, mutually respectful, civilized, with affection for each other, come from the same world, right? We're virtually siblings, right? Brenda and I, we don't agree on this. We don't hate each other over it. We don't shout each other down. We don't ostracize one another. That's what the free speech clause was about. And what I'm saying is, look at what's happening at dinner tables all over America. If you mention Donald Trump, if you mention Black Lives Matter, if you mention Israel, if you mention anything, the dinner is over. They'll stop sending their kids to play with your kids, right? I mean, this is insanity for a nation that purports to believe in free speech. What happened to us, right? Well, I'm saying be like Thane and Brenda. All right, so the answer to that question, look, in law school, they teach you something called the reasonable person test. It comes up as determining a standard by which both rules in civil and criminal law can be analyzed. And what is the reasonable person test? It's what would most people in a very similar situation, in a similar time period, in a similar location do? What would they think? What would the reasonable person do in this situation? And the reason we do that objective test is because we don't want to leave it up to the injured party to say, I was victimized, I was harmed, right? The standard is usually the reasonable person test. You learn this in many, even in contracts, right? What was the reasonable expectation of the person receiving the offer, right? In contracts, right? So I can't say, I thought it meant this. Yeah, that's what you thought because you're mad and you want to collect on the contract. But what would a reasonable person who heard the offer think, right? So let's go back. The reasonable person test can go here. This is why I said before, most jurors, if they're finders of fact, right? It's not like they couldn't understand, especially today when scientists, doctors, neuroscientists could take the stand or have a deposition and when it says, I've examined the person and physically I can tell you that they're suffering from all sorts of things related to the inflammation caused by these words, weapons, persistence and pervasiveness of it. And there's also psychological injury as well. I can see that with brain scans, right? In slip and fall cases, we tolerate a lot of ambiguity, right? We accept it. A person comes into court, they're wearing a neck brace and they're sitting in a wheelchair. His expert says, this person I've examined, he'll never walk again. He'll never even turn his neck again. He's virtually disabled. The other expert comes up and says, are you kidding? He could run the Boston Marathon tomorrow. The jury needs to tolerate that level of ambiguity and make a decision. Why, when it comes to speech, we wouldn't let them do that?
Thank you for that. Next question. Why is it okay to mock some religions but not others? So in your example of the Book of Mormon, why is the portrayal of the Mormon religion there considered free speech and humor? And I guess also if a similar play was made about a different religion, do you think it would have had the same reception?
No.
Where's the line?
No, I'll tell you, no, in the book, I'm very clear about this. It's probably not the politically correct thing to say, but I'll say it anyway, because that's what I do. you know, if you drive your car in the Bible Belt in the United States, I guarantee you, I'm sure someone might, if they're watching from Oklahoma or Kansas, they may say, or Texas, they may, that Thane Rosenbaum, he's right about this. You might see a billboard along one of the highways that says, that has a picture of Jesus on it. And Jesus says, when I buy my next pickup truck, I go to Smith Ford Motors, right? People in the Bible Belt accept that Jesus could be used as a pitchman for a Ford truck, right? No Jew believes that making fun of Moses' speech impediment is a violation of any rule that Jews can't hear. In fact, Jews have a holiday called Purim, which is exactly about that. And, you know, there's so many Jewish comics, they're constantly making fun of Jews and Jewish religion. So no, I actually think that there's something unique about Islam. And the question is, why is Islam more unique, more special? I would argue it's less special. Why? Because it's also a political movement. It's very different. It's very important. That's what a caliphate is about. There's nothing in the Talmud about Jews imposing their will as a government over the world. That is not what the rabbis are talking about. Muhammad is very clear. He's a warrior. He's a prophet, but he's also a warrior. And so there is a movement called political Islam. And so I think that to the extent to which one is critical of the tenets of a religion because of what its politics, right? Or the way it might treat its women, right? You know, I just think that that should be, it's an idea that can be debated. But my good friend Ayaan Hirsi Ali, if you don't know who she is, she was born a Muslim woman. She was experienced female genital circumcision or mutilation. I would call it mutilations. That's what she would say. She is a human rights activist on behalf of women in the Muslim world, but there are death threats against her because she's considered an Islamophobe because she points out the misogyny and violence against women that's permitted under the Quran. And that is considered a racist, which I don't understand. Muslims are not a race, they are a people and a religion. But she has around the clock security when her children go to the park because she's a human rights activist on behalf of women in the Islamic world. So yeah, I think there's obviously something about Islam that's much more special. And I'm asking the question, what? I don't know what it is.
Thank you for that answer as well. Next question. Does a political leader have the right to use their pulpit to lie to the electorate when those lies can and do cause great harm, including serious illness, death, and even the destruction of American democracy, the Constitution, and the rule of law? If that is permissible free speech, what is the difference?
I would say that, first of all, that's what the impeachment process is for. And that's what the election process is for. We just proved, you know, that a president that has policies inimical to democracy, you know, actually could end up in a democratic society losing his second term. So I mean, I would say what we're just experiencing is the answer to that question. But no, I actually think that free speech should not be extending to blatant lies and misinformation. No, I think that, and the reason for that is because of what I've said before, that it's not true that good ideas cancel out bad ideas. It's not really, because certain people, you know, people care what celebrities think. I tend not to. It means nothing to me. You know, I'm trying to think what LeBron James, has a lot of opinion, LeBron. Yeah, I have to tell you, it never once dawned on me that I should listen to LeBron James. But people care about what celebrities say. So yes, I think that once people provide information, there should be a standard, that there should be some recognition that, especially speech that, as I said, what I'm interested in is speech that's not insulting, that's not merely, you know, questionable, but that's harmful, right? I would say that everyone should be subject to this level of either subject to a hate crime or subject to civil damages for the intentional infliction of emotional distress from the words that they use that cause harm. But remember, we live in a very different time. You know, the Chicago Tribune is very different than it was before the fairness doctrine was taken away. It used to be the case when all, especially broadcast radio and television licenses required what was called the fairness doctrine, that controversial opinions and conflicting opinions were required to be presented by the media, right? What we see now with CNN, MSNBC, Newsmax, CNN, that is simply not what we understood it meant to be the media, objective reporting. Today, it's not about providing objective truth, it's about providing a moral lesson that you must know because we know better. That's what the media does today. We know better, and we're telling you. We're not here to provide you alternative points of view. We're not here even to, it's not about fact. It's just a point. It's really about an agenda that we want you to know. We feel very strongly about it. So I would say, look, the answer to that person's questions, we have a lot of problems with misinformation. And part of it is because of that the concept of objective truth, the concept, again, what I said about Brenda, of two parties having a disagreement where the other one says, you know what, here's something you don't even hear anymore, Megan. You don't hear people say, that's an interesting perspective. I don't agree with it, but I'm going to think about it for the next few days. I don't think I'm going to ever agree with it, but thank you for sharing it with me. Who talks like that anymore? Who says that? But that's a respectful, healthy thing to do. Instead, it's reflexive, it's angry, it's impulsive fighting. You cannot say what you just said. And let me just say again, the founding fathers would be shocked.
All right, I actually have a fun one for you.
Fun's good.
Something I was wondering as well, actually. Where is your virtual background?
Oh, wow, you're gonna love this. But I'll tell you who's really gonna love this. I just did an event for, similarly, I wasn't there. And in fact, you could send me this gift, Megan. This is the background for the Long Island Holocaust Museum.
Beautiful.
I just did an event for them, and they said, well, you know, since you're speaking here, let's make it seem like you're speaking here. So they sent me a few pictures, and either you, Megan, or Wendy picked out the one that, I think it was Wendy, picked out the one she liked. And also I want to have a little shout out. Is it Kelly Zaney? Is that her last? Because she was the one who, she and Brenda originally invited me last winter. And I don't know if she's watching, but Kelly, thank you for being my local patron. Yeah, so I thought, you know what would be nice for the Skokie people? That they should see a background of another museum.
That's a great idea. We might actually have to try that ourselves.
Yes, and send me one and I'll use it and I'll say, by the way, that's from Skokie.
Great. We'll have to work on that. And then I have one final question for you too. Can you tell us what your next project is or your next book? So
I write both fiction and nonfiction, which in the modern era is apparently very unusual. And I write essays. You know, I'm just a workman-like journeyman writer. I'll write anything. I can do a laundry list, a menu. You ask, I can do it. So my next book is a novel. The problem with novels, Megan, and the person who asked the question is, I never talk about them until they're done. I don't even give people the title. With nonfiction, I'm constantly telling people, for years I was discussing this book on free speech everywhere I went. You know why? Because I learned stuff. People would say things, they would raise their hand. I figured, hey, this is about free speech, teach me. So for years, I wrote essays about this issue. I know that one of my essays in the Daily Beast was anthologized in a high school textbook. I was so thrilled by that I was, taking batting practice with free speech. I was learning more from my teaching, my writings, my lectures around the country. But with my next book is a novel. The only thing I can say that it's set in Harlem. That's all I will say. And I'm moving nicely. The pandemic makes it possible to finish faster.
Right. Great. Well, something that we can all look forward to then.
Thank you.
Sure. Again, I would just want to extend a huge thank you to you for sharing your knowledge and your insight with us today. It was a really interesting and fascinating presentation.
Well, thank you for including me, for inviting me, for welcoming me, and sending a shout out of love to my high school childhood friend, Brenda Hoffman-Feiss.
Yes, and a thank you to Brenda as well for her wonderful introduction and for making this connection possible for our museum. Before we do sign off today, I have a few quick announcements. One, if you could please take a moment and fill out a brief survey about today's program that we put in the chat. We would deeply appreciate your feedback, and of course, it always helps us to know how we're doing and what we should be doing in the future as well. Second, we have many wonderful virtual public programs scheduled for 2021 that you can find on our events page, which Wendy also put in the chat for easy access for everyone. And I did want to call out one program in particular that will be coming up on January 8th at noon. This program is a lunch and learn again, and it will be on the poetry of psychological resistance at Auschwitz, the words of Christina Javolska. So while imprisoned in Auschwitz-Birkenau, Polish political prisoner Christina Javolska wrote dozens of poems and songs which were shared among camp prisoners. Her poetry has endured through the decades and continues to shine a light on the complicated world of oppressors and the oppressed, as well as poetry and music as instruments of psychological resistance and witnessing. So we invite you all to join our virtual lunch and learn session with Dr. Barbara Maluski, Associate Professor of Music at Swarthmore College, where she will present her research on Christina's remarkable life and her resistance poetry. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today for this program, and I hope you all have happy holidays and stay safe and take care. Thank you.